Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the third session of Out from the Shadow Conference 2024. And this session is Knitted Together, Fiber Crafts as Tools of Community, Continuity, and Courage Through the Ages. Let's welcome our first presenter, Dr. Shelley Carter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me pull up the slides and we'll go ahead and get started. Um, Now, I will say we're going to have two very distinct slide decks and speakers. I am going to go first, and I'll let Mary do what detailed introduction she would like at her portion, but I'm going to say she's the one that really knows her stuff about history. Knitting is a passion hobby for me. I am actually a molecular biologist by training, so it's very much outside my professional bailiwick. But I think that's a great point of the Out from Shadows conference is we are all diverse individuals. And so for my portion, I'm going to talk briefly about the likely origins of knitting and take us all the way to modern times and highlight some of the ways that it has been used in a more, shall we call, subversive manner or outside what we perceive as the norms. And then Mary is going to talk in fabulous detail about knitting and craftivism as she embodies it as a public historian focused on underrepresented individuals. So when we talk about knitting, I know I grew up in the deep south of the United States. So to me, knitting was something that conceptually was always associated with cold and maybe northern climates or extreme southern climates. Definitely not what we would consider hot climates. But in fact, knitting likely originated in the Arab world and spread via the Crusades to Spain. It actually seems to have originated in the form we know it today in what are known as knitting looms. So, sort of structures that you used as opposed to the needles. And that's just important because if we look at where knitting has come to today, knitting looms are popular again or still, but there can be some sort of divisiveness over that. Oh, you're using a loom, you're not a real, two needle knitter. But the original form of a needle-based craft as we know it was probably from around 1000 BC. It was knoll binding in the Danish world, and it was a very rudimentary form of knitting that actually used a single hooked tool. So it was more akin to what we think of as crochet today, as opposed to actual knitting. But the two needle craft that we think of as knitting today um, originated again in the Middle East. We have in the image shown on the slide the first, or sorry, not the first, the oldest confirmed two needle knitted socks. These originated or were found in Egypt and have been dated to around 1200 AD, but they were not originally from Egypt. They were likely Indian in origin. So again, even at 1200 AD, we have very diverse global distribution of the craft that we know of as knitting now. And then yarn crawls are sort of a modern term for when a bunch of knitting or yarn stores get together and people move from them. So you can think bar crawl, pub crawl, however you want to think it. People do yarn crawls and they visit different shops. But yarn also crawled around the world. And as I mentioned earlier, it did spread via the Crusades, initially to Spain. And at that point in time, it was focused on luxury items, predominantly for the clergy. So this did not require heavy equipment. It was very easy and transportable, especially compared to when we think of tapestry looms and weaving, which were early luxury items. But it was focused initially on the Catholic Church. Around 1500 AD, we have a second stitch invented. So if you use American terminology, the two stitches are a knit and a purl. I believe in most of Europe, it's just called a stitch and a purl, but the second stitch is the purl. And what that second stitch enabled was a change in the drape and the feel of knitted products, and that really further opened up what could be created with them. When we look globally at the history of knitting, the origins or introduction into Asia are still particularly murky from a historical standpoint. It is thought possibly that around 1542, some lost Portuguese sailors may have introduced it into Japan. And knitting entered the New World, continental North America, with missionaries. And at that point in time, we also began to see fiber changes in terms of the crafting materials used, especially by indigenous people. So European women and missionaries were the ones that introduced knitting to Native women. And that caused a big tribal shift from the use of traditional materials like buffalo hides and deerskin to the introduction of more knitted sweaters. Now, this actually became very important as a community building tool within the tribes. It was a means for them to achieve some financial independence, which was really, really important because the forced changes as a result of Christian conversion in the tribal system really impacted and destroyed their traditional livelihoods and sense of community. Again, knitting is portable as we know it today, especially and even then with the two needles. So it helps maintain continuity and community as the European approach to really destroying the previous native system. And this image shown in this case is from the think this was around 14th century image, and it shows at this point in time women knitting, which is going to become important in just a second. And it shows the use of 4 needles, which is where you begin to be able to make more smooth circular structures, as opposed to when you're using 2 needles, you have to do a back and forth and then seam them. So when you begin to introduce additional needles, you can craft in a complete circle, tying back to the idea of changes in drape and feel of our knitted products. So knitting becomes business, and actually arguably originates as business. It was trade items, but before it was trade items and before it became that introduction to the clergy via the Crusades, it really was so prolific and persistent across the globe because it equals survival. These were coverings originally. It was very practical originally. So then we get to luxury later, and it can be jazzed up with embroidery, tapestry work. But when it reaches the stage of being luxury focused, at that point in time, that work is being done predominantly by male knitters. And the women's work remained that more practical. What are we doing for coverage of bodies? What are we doing for warmth? But again, business and how do you make money? So as early as 1524, we do have our first pattern books being sold. Um, in the history of colonization and birth of the United States as its own entity, we have wool being worth more than tobacco in Virginia in the late 1600s. And in 1699, the Wool Act was introduced. This was one of the things that sort of precipitated eventually the American Revolution. But what we have is the colonies being prohibited from exporting their wool and instead being forced to import British wool and fabrics and being heavily taxed. This led to a boycott of British wool, and this actually was the origins of the Daughters of Liberty and eventually what we call spinning bees. So women coming together, working together on fiber craft, and they did this as they were staging competitions among themselves in order to meet the textile needs of the colonies in the face of these prohibitions on exporting wool and being required to import the more expensive British wools. Moving forward quite a bit in the 1850s, we do have knitted socks being recognized as legal tender. This is the same point in time in which beaver pelts and wheat, other staples of subsistence, were recognized as legal tender during the westward expansion. And women frequently gathered together to knit. And in that way, they recreated a sense of home that many of them had left as they began that westward migration. Going forward even further, we have the Great Depression, we have 2 world wars, we have Western females population especially beginning to knit and represent the biggest consumer market for yarn manufacturing companies. And at that point in time, as we're shifting away from war production to civilian needs, women consumers, female consumers, began to be the target market for those. And patterns, in fact, were often used as marketing tools rather than simply being passed down from one knitter to a next or being unique designs for the knitter. Generally, patterns at that point in time are what we would consider to be unisex, sort of family styles. So there wouldn't be a different cut for men versus women, boys versus girls. It would be unisex, easily passed down. But again, these at this point in time, knitting is predominantly a female craft, and so it sort of ties into what we would consider the ideal of that domestic goddess who's taking care of her family and is feeding and clothing them and taking care of the inside. Then by the 1950s, we have knitting shifting away from that idea of utilitarian, very unisex, and instead we have, especially in the French and the Italian Riviera, women knitting high fashion for themselves. So they began to adapt Chanel style suits and coats into knitting patterns. And you began to see women knitting more luxury items. You begin to see more use of luxury fibers such as Angora, which is very soft. You see cashmere, you see handbags being knitted. And at that point in time, women became more powerful consumers as a standalone entity. So they're not just knitting for the family, they're knitting for themselves as much as they are. And this image shows some of those early luxury gloves. These are probably from the 1500s, sometime in the 1500s, and these are Spanish clergy gloves. So that's sort of how we shift from this idea of knitting as a very functional subsistence style activity, and we begin to get into the idea of knitting as a business. But knitting also has played a heavy role in historical politics. So I mentioned already the Wool Act of 1699 and the origins of the Daughters of Liberty and spinning bees. We also had knitting very prevalent during the French Revolution, and you had the Tricoteuses, who were the knitting women of the French Revolution. They sat, they did knit-ins, they protested, they frequently knitted during trials associated with the French Revolution, and most importantly, they were known to sit by the guillotine and watch the beheadings. And as the French Revolution progressed and it was trying to sort of clean its image up, they wanted to get away from that idea of these sort of loud, boisterous women reveling in executions. And the knitting women were banned from a lot of the political discourses, and that's really where they began to shift to the sidelines and watch the executions at the guillotines. In the world wars, we see knitters very prevalent as, if not activist, at least essential parts of the war effort. So in World War I in particular, we had what was known as spontaneous knitting to clothe the soldiers. And so that is where garments, existing garments would be unraveled and that yarn would be repurposed to make socks, balaclavas, scarves to send forward to the trenches to keep the soldiers warm. That also is a time in which the British government, especially, began to be more active in knitting as a practice. So that's the likely origin of what's known as the Kitchener stitch, for those of you who may be knitters. The British Secretary of State developed a specific closure technique for knitted items. It's used often with socks or to seal any what should be a circular knitted item that's not knitted in the round. But that is a common toe closure, especially. And also at that point in time, we begin to see bans on printed knitting patterns because knitting is fundamentally or can be viewed as a binary code. You have two basic stitches, equivalent to a 0 and 1. You do have some other fancy embellishments you can add, but within a knitting pattern, it was believed and perceived that you could hide code and send messages. And so knitting became much more overseen, if you will. And this was not simple panic or hysteria from those in power. In fact, we do know that knitters, either actively as knitters or under the guise of knitting, were serving as spies. So in World War I, we have a famous knitter who actually sat in her upstairs window and knitted items and watched the movement of soldiers in the loading yard below her house. And she tapped her feet, and her children recorded the code that she was tapping, and that was passed on. In World War II, when we have the ban on printed patterns, you still could pass messages in knitted items themselves using a code. And we do have the Belgian resistance in particular known to have used actual knitting to pass messages, especially info on train movements. The Red Spy Queen, as she was known, Elizabeth Bentley, hid clandestine items, materials, messages in her knitting bag. So when she was stopped and searched, it just looked like a bunch of yarn and needles all jumbled together. And then we also have Pippa Latour Dole, who parachuted into occupied France, and she recorded observations while biking around the countryside, pretending to knit. So again, she was carrying them in her knitting. So knitting is much more than what some of us may have thought of it previously. Moving all the way to modern times, we do have what is now known as craftivism, and Mary's really going to talk a lot about that in her portion. But this arguably began in its modern form with the American hippie movement as a sort of rejection of that consumerism, global manufacturing. The hippies wanted to make their own products. This at times was viewed to be at odds with the feminist movement, because in the feminist movement, many chose to reject the idea of a female-centric craft. Ultimately, though, knitting and crochet was something that was very difficult to sort out. So it ultimately, so one side of the feminist movement saw that as unrewarded labor and female oppression, but the other saw it as a way to express their creativity and independence. And so at that point in time, knitting shifted away from the political as a result of the feminist movement and more into the personal. So if you will, you may knit. If you do not, do not. So again, I mentioned the hippie movement. And then in more recent times, more current events, if you will, the Global Knit-In occurred in 2002 at the G8 Summit. They called themselves the Revolutionary Knitting Circle. It was a protest group that originated in Calgary, Canada in 2000. And it's really seen as the modern formation of this idea of craftivism. In 2005, we have the body count mittens. This was a pattern and an activity by a knitter by the name of Lisa Ann Alberbach. She was knitting mittens during the first Iraqi war. And every time she reached the middle of the mitten, she would put a body count, the death count for the day. And the death count was increasing at such a rate day to day that no two pair of mittens have the same number body count on both mittens. So the second mitten always had a much higher number. In 2006, we have a Danish artist knitting pink tea cozy that was large enough to cover a tank. Hence how she chose to protest the Iraq War. In 2012, we have Knitting Nanas Against Gas. This was an Australian movement protesting mining and gas industry. Many in the audience who are American may remember the Pussy Hat Project in the 2017 Women's March on Washington. That is was a very prevalent symbol at the march. And if you are a knitter, there are lots of free Pussy Hat knitting patterns available. And then the same group also created the Welcome Blanket Initiative, in which they were knitting blankets for immigrants, most especially children who were separated from their parents as they were entering the United States. And then on sort of the less global politics or protest, we have the idea of yarn bombing. And this is where local crafters will come together and will cover public features with knitted items. So this could be light poles, sometimes it's park benches, but a lot of times this is something that's very prevalent where I live around the Worldwide Knit in Public Day. Local groups will get together, they will knit items, and then they will yarn bomb the area they've been knitting in. But up to this point, after we made the shift away from men knitting those luxury items, we've been talking predominantly about women as knitters. And one of the great things about knitting is it continues to be a tool and hobby enjoyed by many diverse groups. And so for my last portion, I wanted to close out on some notable non-female knitters. We have Louis Boris, who founded the Brooklyn Boy Knits. He went viral in 2017 when he was photographed knitting in public. I believe he was on a subway. When that image went viral, he actually used that as the push he needed to launch the Brooklyn Boys Knit, which was a business he always wanted to found but didn't feel he could. Tom Daley is a very well-known figure. He is the British diver and swimmer who is known for knitting. He knit at both the Tokyo Olympics and more recently at the Paris Olympics. He has launched a company known as Made with Love, and he has a number of both commercial and passion or civic projects. So his recent initiative earlier this summer was about awareness of head injuries in divers. And so a lot of his patterns were focused on that message. And then the Ombres Tejedores, this is actually very close to my knitting origins, which is why I wanted to close to them. These are the male knitters in Chile. They are often photographed knitting in public, like this image shows, and their desire is to challenge the idea of modern masculinity and what it means and what it does not mean. And the reason I say this is close to my knitting origins, so in a previous life, I was a government program manager. And one of the teams I worked on once was composed of two other PhDs and then a woman with a background in theater costume design. And the other two PhDs were male, and they said I don't think they quite understood some of the inadvertent hubris behind their statement, but what they said was, well, if she can do it, we want to do it too. So this woman taught the three of us to knit. And so my original knitting circle was half male. So that's why I wanted to close here. And so that's where I'm going to stop on the history of knitting, and I'm going to drop my slides and turn it over to Mary, and she will have much more amazing images to show us.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, so the pressure is on now for for a slideshow. I'm just going to share my screen. I think that hopefully that's a yes, that everyone can see that. Firstly, I just want to thank the organizers and also Shelley for inviting me. I would never have thought and even known about this without Shelley. So yeah, and thank you also to Kinjo for sort of guiding us through over the past few months. He's been really on the ball, especially when we haven't, or when I haven't been. So that's my confession for today. So I'm just going to jump right into it. When we think of crafting and the arts, whether it's fiber arts or pottery or metalwork or painting, graffiti, or whatever it may be, we all come to these things for different reasons. And so whether you consider yourself an expert crafter or a hobbyist, think back to when you started out. We learned a little bit from, Shelley's sort of origin story. Maybe you learned a particular art as a child, or perhaps you came to it later in life. And think about what that did for you and how that came about and why you've stuck with it. Just going to get this working. Have you ever thought about what it does for you? For many people, the arts simply brings joy. Sometimes this is an activity or activities one would do outside of regular work, or perhaps just an escape, relax, or as resistance. So in a nutshell, if we think about it, no matter how mundane one's story might be, we all have a story. And this is how we come to crafting and why. So before I get into the core of what I'd like to discuss today, I'll just give you a little background on who I am and how Dr. Carter and I found each other. In terms of my training, I am not a molecular biologist. I am the opposite. I'm a literary historian focusing on the early Middle Ages, most specifically pre-conquest England. And so some of my areas of specialization are uncovering what race is in the European Middle Ages, and that's particularly in early England, and that's a time before 1066, analyzing cultural shifts, literary texts, investigating figures, archaeological data, researching ideas like anti-Blackness, discussing hidden figures, and I also work with manuscripts. So just on the screen here is just very quickly, these are amethyst beads, and that's a map of early England before 1066. And so if you see the little dots on the screen, those are where in graves, so there's grave goods that are found. And these are, there's evidence of amethysts that are from the Eastern Mediterranean. So there was obviously interaction and migration, and this is also art and crafting. Here again, there's ivory from as far away as India. And you can see that it's just sort of scattered all across England, not so much in Scotland in the corner there. And then also some Mediterranean uh, metalwork as well, and the artistry that went into that. So there was a lots of migration and interaction that we don't actually discuss very often. Other work that I do is with Old English poems, researching apocryphal texts, and I also specialize in hell, which is fitting because academia and higher education is often a hell of its own. So when Shelley approached me to to be part of this panel, I was a little bit apprehensive because oh, I'm just jumping through the slides there. Yeah, I was a bit apprehensive because the history of knitting isn't my wheelhouse, and I'm so glad that she shared this information. I learned a lot, even about the Middle Ages, through her talk. So thank you for that. So you know a little bit about my professional background, but what catapulted me into a different trajectory within academia to combine activism before getting into crafting full time was when I resigned from an organization where I was the second vice president of, and I didn't expect the international media attention that it received. And so this is one of those stuffy organizations, most esteemed scholarly organization in my field, and its name was annoyingly titled the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists. And I won't bore you with the details of how my field is a racist and sexist mess, but by and large, it has stopped using the term Anglo-Saxon. Years ago, there was an international sort of discussion that I ended up being at the center of for shedding light on some of the problems in the field. And along the way, the term Anglo-Saxon got picked up, and I and others had pointed out that the term was misappropriated. It wasn't just misappropriated by white supremacists, but it was also just inaccurate for a term for pre-conquest England. So basically, the term as we know it has been used for colonization, and it resurfaced 400 years after 1066, when England was setting its sights on colonialism and imperialist endeavors. But keep in mind that it was never used as an identity marker for the people of early England. And I promise you this isn't a history lesson and on terms and whatever. So that's basically the history of the name of the organization, and was used in my field to describe the people that we discussed. So basically we were asked, it might come as a surprise to you that I was also one of the only people of color in my entire field. And over the decades, there's been a number of Black and Brown folks who were forced out and pivoted out of the field in part or completely because of racism. And this is also something that I've written about. Racism is in every sector, as we know, it's in every field and industry, and yes, and even in the arts. And we learn to cope with racism. We learn from very young. This is just medieval studies in a nutshell. That's basically us. That's how we operate in life. Just kind of falling through life. um, so we learn from very young, maybe even before we can fully comprehend what racism is, uh, what it is. And I won't say that we BIPOC, and by BIPOC, that's just an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. It's not perfect, but it's kind of a broad um, sort of word. Uh, I won't say that we ignore racism because it's a constant struggle, but many of us pick up and choose our battles. And just because we don't publicly or explicitly correct a racist or point out racism, that doesn't mean that we aren't affected by it. And visible minorities, folks, or the minoritized folks, have to internalize a lot. And so everyday stress of, that we all sort of experience, life and work and family and money and the news, is compounded with that added layer of stress, of racism, in some cases anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous hates, for some it's anti-Arab hate, Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism. So digging a little bit deeper for those who care, I'm mixed race, Afro-Indo, Caribbean roots, originally from the African and Asian diaspora. And I like to refer to myself as a Halfro. So I think part of the reason that my story caught the attention of in the news was because of my tokenization in the field and in the org formerly known as ISAS. Although I was at the time an independent scholar, and I was just about to start a fellowship at the University of Toronto. And the rest of the board was tenured, and I wasn't willing to play some sort of respectability politics. And when it came to our humanity and our safety, the field just wasn't ready. Wasn't really sure how to handle this rogue scholar who just wasn't willing to pay that respect, play those respectability politics games. So while I and some others were in the news, and despite the right wing media running with their own narratives, the field was changing and it continues to do so. Broadview and Norton anthologies have removed the term Anglo Saxon from their texts. Universities and departments are around the globe actually are changing their name or updating terms and names. As recently as this year, Cambridge decided to change the name of their prestigious journal, Anglo-Saxon Studies. So that's enough about that. Let's talk about some yarn. For many of us in the crafting world, we use this as an escape from white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and bigotry. This is a way for us to tap into our creativity and take back our time. One thing that white supremacy is good at is robbing us of time. We spend a lot of our days being bombarded with racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenousness, and this racial aggression and violence robs us of our time. And in the process, it takes away pieces of us too. It just isn't a time thief in terms of the actual hours that we spend dealing with racism, whether it's an incident that we've experienced and has consumed our minds, or whether it's advocating for racial justice or in whatever capacity. All of this is time consuming and it eats away at our mental health and our well-being. Heart attacks, strokes, and are more increasingly linked to racism, particularly in Black men and women. And in my own academic world, I've seen Black and brown women especially die before 60 with no other explanation other than compounded stress with racism and sometimes sexism. And I know that this is all just, depressing. So let's get to some better stuff. Like many of you here, I had an interest in crafting as a child. And as I got older and went into higher education, I began crocheting and knitting as a form of relatively inexpensive therapy. And added motivation was that I wanted to be able to make things for my little one, and hats and blankets and toys. And until a couple of years ago, I didn't know how to dye yarn at all. And I was intrigued by the process, and I loved buying indie dyed yarn when I could afford it. Something about an individual putting their love and attention into making something beautiful for others to use and create beautiful projects is a little poetic for me. And I like the idea of us being interlinked in that way as well. Early in my crafting journey, I was making, surprise gifts for friends and family and burned out colleagues. And I eventually wanted to feel more connected to the material that I was using. And I wanted to be able to create projects that had even more meaning and depth for the recipients. At the same point, when I was dreaming about yarn colorways, I was also being hunted by white supremacist militia groups like the Oath Keepers, the Sons of Odin, National Front, and many others in the UK, Canada, and beyond. Being in the news with people like Piers Morgan trying to get me to answer their calls for interviews was unnerving. I was being used as a lightning rod for my field, and more broadly or larger for academic discussions on race and racism. And in all this, I was burning out. And uh, the attention that, so here, I mean, I won't keep this up on the screen, but this is just some of the, I was getting constant death threats and whatever, and it was just sort of taking its toll. The attention made me a beacon for people outside of my field. So I ended up being this public figure, this, goofy little kid from the hood who somehow attained a PhD, was attracting the attention of struggling BIPOC and marginalized scholars in astrophysics and biology and classics and anthropology and math and philosophy and whatever. And as much as I was grateful for these connections, I didn't know what to do apart from just being loud about injustice. And I had this army and I didn't know what to do with it. So my own health was taking a complete nosedive. I was losing my hair in clumps and I was having autoimmune and stress related flare ups that were affecting my eyes and my skin, my hearing, my heart. And something had to give. And my body, unfortunately, was starting to give whether I wanted to continue to fight or not. So I decided to leave academia and focus on public education, teaching the public for free or for a small amount on Patreon, and began encouraging crafting as a form of resistance. And that's something that Shelley talked about. I took a deep dive into learning the art of dyeing and started experimenting. And shortly after, I started a small business creating colorways as a pedagogical way to teach and highlight hidden or forgotten figures of color in mostly European pre-modern history. And this is where I actually met Shelley when she joined Republic of Yarnia's monthly anti-racist yarn club, where I sent out a special yarn skein each month with, some extras and a little write-up on a figure, a manuscript, and its history. So it's a lesson in crafting in one, but equally important is in these initiatives is to help us to take back our time. It's a packed program to teach people to question assumptions about the past and to correct whitewashed narratives, to provide relief and escapes from everyday stress and to center and restore ourselves. So like my mom always says, you can't be good to anyone if you aren't good to you first. So that's for mom. One of the things I do at Republic of Yarnia is question previous assumptions about history. For Afro-pessimists like Frank Wilderson, emancipation is a myth. And just like Calvinists believe in predestination, Black folks seem predestined to navigate the world in figurative shackles. The idea of Blackness being continuously associated with enslavement is evidence in Western research and pre and early modern studies. Often Black presence is dismissed and rationalized through presumed stories of enslavement. Basically, every Black figure discovered or found is explained away as, well, they must have been enslaved. And this is very much about approaching Blackness with the wrong questions from the outset. How did an image of a Black man in an abbreviato of England's 13th century doomsday book, how did he end up there? Why have previous scholars often written this figure off as an enslaved person rather than a commoner? His tiger-like tunic and zigzagged pumpkiny orange and blue tights indicate that he was probably not a nobleman, but that by no means indicates that he was enslaved. Blackness is flattened to strip Black people of humanity. A white lens doesn't give Black people agency to be present in pre-modern Europe other than through slavery. And in some cases, enslavement is true, but the idea of race and racism was not exclusively demarcated by skin color. And if we read texts and medieval images more carefully, we see hidden figures we have often overlooked, ignored, dismissed, erased, or described as simply enslaved. And there are often Black figures, some historical, who have been whitewashed throughout history. They literally become white as the centuries go on, kind of like the depictions of Jesus, a dark-skinned Palestinian who transformed into a Northern European, dirty blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure who has dominated for centuries. An example of whitewashing is a legendary 3rd century Black Theban legionnaire, Saint Maurice, who was always depicted as Black, being from Egypt, but as his story developed and traveled to Europe throughout the Middle Ages, he eventually lost all of his melanin. And these are some of the depictions of him in his Blackness, and he has several colorways. I also research figures of Black leaders and revolutionaries, sometimes in places that we would least expect it in the West. Croatia and Russia, for example, reveal stories of Black generals and kings. And medieval depictions of Black kings from Africa fought off invasions from the north. For those, and actually, Shelley is actually wearing her beautiful cowl is is from the figure in the upper left. That's Hannibal, and he was a Russian general. So these are some examples of what I work with in Yarnia, but there are many other colorways based on hidden figures that makes them the focal point after centuries of being in the dark. There are regular colorways in the shop, but also special ones, like the ones featured, the community that Shelley's part of that learns together and makes it a priority to use their knitting needles and crochet hooks as a weapon to fight white supremacy. And I understand why many have or they choose to remain in their industries and in academia. And I believe that those who remain should never stop being disruptive because we are neither safe nor free. And I've been painted myself as an angry Black woman, a hostile harasser, both hyper visible and visible and invisible. People become transfixed on the reactions and responses of the abused rather than seeing the years of abuse that came before that. And for me and others, escape from the confines of higher education is not just running away from problems and racism. As scholars, we are often encouraged to think outside the box. But we still kind of limit ourselves to accepting traditional institutional restrictive frameworks. So I created my own miracle and I left academia. The miracle's colorway is splashes of soft pink and a deep reddish purple with teal. The red specks reflect the vibrant hat on this Black figure's head. The shimmery silver in the figure's neckline and collar is reflected in the sheen of the silk. The soft feeling is a sensory delight as it soothes and provides comfort. This yarn gives a lot in different ways by tapping into different senses. The colorway is inspired by a figure from the 1775 painting, The Wedding Feast of Cana, by the Italian painter Gaetano Gandolfi. The Black figure, although unnamed, is central in a large image depicting Jesus's first miracle when he turns water into wine at a wedding feast. Our gaze turns to the Black figure holding a silvery gold tray with a goblet. As he serves, we are reminded that we can serve too, whereas in academia encourages research. Where hoarding knowledge, crafting allows, we're hoarding knowledge. And crafting, on the other hand, allows us to think of others, whether it's in the materials we use, the creations we make, the patterns we use, or what we do with our final projects. So if it wasn't apparent, I don't just plop colors down with no meaning or with little thought. It's art. It's like art inception. Art in art, and fiber artists like Shelley create even more art. So part of my revolt against traditional academic learning and colonial narratives means sharing hidden stories, offering yarn, giving gifts, creating free crochet tutorials and patterns to encourage people to carve out time away from the daily and persistent battles of heteropatriarchy and white supremacy. And this is the essence of helping others find liberation. Rachel, capitalism, as Cedric Robinson put it, makes Black people commodities. To give unconditionally is an act of rebellion against capitalism. Showing beauty and blackness and otherness and working with the oppressed in mind is also an act of resistance, particularly given what's going on in Palestine, Sudan, Congo, and Haiti. Fiber arts can be therapeutic and restorative, as well as provide ways to express solidarity, mourning, celebration, and can act as forms of resistance and speaking truth to power when we are silenced in other ways. In Yarnia, we give because, after all, a well-known Palestinian man born some 2,000 years ago stated that it was better to give than receive. Dreaming of colorways has brought a type of freedom and relief that I didn't think was possible. Being able to express myself through the art of dyeing, combined with my specialization in medieval history, has created an alchemical solution to silencing Black voices in the present and in history. It's my magic. No matter the creative art that one chooses, it can be used to speak truth to power in invaluable ways. For me, your hooks and your needles can function as weapons against white supremacy, and they, as well as other art forms and mediums outside the master's house, chip away at white supremacy's foundations. So I no longer feel like I'm dying in the literal sense. Dying, D-Y-E, yarn has given me a way to heal and feel alive again. And I hope that you too will find creative outlets as a form of liberation too.
This was so unexpected, the whole presentation. And I love how, like, Shelley, when you were speaking, I was like, God, I never thought of it before. It never occurred to me before, like the domestic part of this leading to literally resistance for women to have a voice, right? And now, Mary, the way you've taken that and created your own way of teaching, giving voice, not just to yourself, but to others who need it, who need to be taught, awakened, through color, through it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. We probably only have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if anyone has a question, please drop it into the chat.
As everyone types, Jackie, I saw your question earlier. So the Wool Act boycotts were organized and enacted solely by the women. The men were busy doing other things.
It's shockingly early for that to be true, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. So I will also say, so yes, I am one of the Yarnians. But Mary and I actually met for the first time on Twitter, and I will call it Twitter, not X, because I left. Actually, I left since then. But I mean, that was just one of those weird coincidences. And it's like Mary said, it was different scientists that I followed that led me to her post, and then I started following her, and it was just she definitely is a lightning rod, sometimes for the good things.
Absolutely, and I hope you see that there are those of us in academia who are trying to expand our understanding, the understanding of the world, the ways of knowing, and this is why we fight so hard to keep this as part of our program. Thank you both, ladies. I appreciate it, and thank you to all that have come.